Hello Lunasians, I hope this video finds you well. Welcome to this short tutorial. Today we will learn how to evaluate cards in Axie Infinity. With the looming of Season 20 around the corner, I figured it's time to make a tutorial that for somehow 20 seasons have never been made before. So here we are. Do take note that this video was made during Season 19 off-season, and therefore a lot of the cards discussed here are based on the Season 19 cards. So, have you ever wondered why some pros always say that certain cards are amazing, but you have no idea why? Do you want to know how to immediately evaluate whether cards are good or bad right after a balance change? Do you want to simply look at the team of Axies and roughly know if this team is going to turn out good or bad? Or maybe you're trying to build a new team and want to go for budget builds. How do you know what cards are good? Well, today we will attempt to answer those questions by explaining the card interactions in a logical and concise form. Before we continue, we will assume class advantage or disadvantage, and some class bonuses will not apply unless stated otherwise. This is to simplify calculations. Now that the introductions are over, let's get on to it. 150. The first and most important consideration when evaluating cards is how close the card stats are to the number 150. Right now, all the card stats in Axie Infinity is balanced around the number 150. That means when you combine damage and shield, you want the number to be as close as possible to 150, or higher if possible. Why is this important? That's because you can only play 4 cards per Axie. That means there's a limited amount of damage or defense that you can put up every turn on an Axie. If you're playing cards with more stats than your opponent, you will always win, all else being equal. For example, if you had an Axie that could only play Shoalstar versus an Axie that could only play Orenda, the Axie that plays Orenda will always win against the Axie that plays Shoalstar, all else being equal. This is because Orenda has a total of 150 stats, while Shoalstar only has 120 stats. Cardability Matters. One of the most common ways cards can circumvent the 150 stat rule is by having a card ability. If your card ability allows you to get more than 150 stats and is fairly easy to achieve, then in general it is better. For example, Cerestes has 90 damage and 60 shields to give you a total of 150 stats. This makes it a good card, but the ability allows you to deal 130% damage if the opponent is faster. And since reptiles in general are the second slowest class, you will most likely deal the 130% bonus damage reliably, which means you can most likely do 117 damage and get 60 shields for a total of 177 stats. This alone makes it better than something like Sandal that has a total of 160 base stats. Of course, you can also argue that Sandal gives it an ability that will deal more damage than Cerestes against bugs. But because the ability is very narrow, Cerestes will most likely be the better card, most of the time. Healing cards get a special mention here. You can think of the heal component of cards like Anemone as slightly worse versions of shields, because in theory, shields can stack as high as you want. But your heals are wasted if your Axie is at full health. We won't go into the details about healing versus shield. And for our purposes today, we will simply assume healing to be equals to shield. Therefore, a card like Anemone that gives 80 damage, 35 shields, and 100 HP, assuming you have the double Anemone parts, has a whopping total of 215 stats. If you cannot kill the Anemone in one turn and allow it to heal up, you are almost always going to fall behind on the stat race. Just the shields plus heals alone is a massive 135 stats, which is enough to negate most damage cards in Axie Infinity. This is why healing tanks in general are such a pain to deal with. Lucky for us, most healing cards lack a damage component such as cards like Shiitake and Rosebud, therefore making them very annoying, but that's roughly it. But make no mistake that healing cards usually have very massive stats. The second special mention is Reflect cards. This one is actually harder to gauge, because ultimately it is a reactive card, where you need the opponent to attack into you for the effect to happen. But if you put them in the backline Axie, you're almost guaranteed for the effect to trigger in a 1v1 situation. The thing about Reflect cards is that it is an absolutely insane mechanic. For example, Indian Star reflects 40% damage and Scaly Spoon reflects 50% damage. Meaning if you deal 120 damage attack into Scaly Spoon for example, you take 60 damage back. You can basically consider this Reflect component as an additional damage of Scaly Spoon, which by the way already has 80 damage and 50 shields, which gives it 130 base stats. Now that's a decent amount of stats. Can you imagine a card that does 200 plus damage and also give 50 shields? Although the stars do have to align for this to happen, it is entirely possible with Reflect cards. Our final example is Feather Spear or Scaly Spear. First of all, this card is amazing with 160 base stats. But if you have a lunge card on 2 or more Axies, you can very reliably chain the lunge card for the 120% damage bonus. This means that it becomes fairly easy to get the 132 attack plus 50 shields, giving it a whopping 182 stats. The only real downside is that you must commit to the combo occupying a Precious Horn slot in 2 or more Axies, which at the moment is competing with a lot of other good cards such as Eggshell or Kestrel for birds, and Cerestis Incisor for reptiles. However, if you're not going to use the Horn cards for anything special, Feather Spear or Scaly Spear is an exceptional card that should see more play. In fact, even if it was played by itself without any chain, it is still a better card than Shoalstar or even Orenda for example. If you wanted a better Aqua Horn card, I would recommend playing Feather Spear. Axie stat bonuses matter. As you know, every class gives a certain amount of Axie stats. For example, a plant card will give 3 HP and 1 morale. These stats matter to the Axie as a whole and should be taken into consideration when evaluating a card. Let's take a look at these two cards, Red Ear and Pumpkin. By looking at these two cards individually, Red Ear is always going to be the better card compared to Pumpkin. Red Ear has 155 base stats and can potentially get you even more if you have an adjacent teammate. Pumpkin on the other hand only gives 110 shields. So why don't we see more people play Red Ear on their plant tanks? The answer to that is simply because of class stats. Most plants have Cactus, which wants to go last to get maximum benefit. Therefore, having Red Ear in your plant makes the Axie faster than the opponent's Axie, which means that it will not reliably benefit from Cactus. It is for this reason that many people still go for Pumpkin despite having many other cards out there with higher shields. But again, if you're not using Cactus as a horn part and you're not going for the slower speed, you can definitely go for Red Ear on your plant. These cards are definitely better than Pumpkin if you only compare them individually. You need to compare against competing cards in that card slot. As a follow-up to the previous rule, you also need to compare what these cards are competing against in that particular card slot. Let's look at what I mean. Have a look at the card Timber. As I've mentioned previously, Timber is an amazing card because it has a total of 160 base stats, and it may potentially give you up to 240 stats if your Axie hits an enemy plant. This is a massive amount of stats. But why do you not see it played at all on plant and reptile tanks? First of all, Timber is a beast card, which gives it 1 speed and 3 morale, but no health. Most plant and reptile tanks want to be as slow as possible and have as much health as possible. Timber doesn't really give the right stats. And the other reason is because Timber occupies a slot in the back. This part type competes with a lot of other good cards such as Bone Sail, Watering Can, Snail Shell, Sandal, Pumpkins, or even Bidens. Therefore, when evaluating cards, having a high stat is not the only consideration. Class stats and competing cards in the same slot matter. Class advantage matters. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that we will not be considering class advantage or disadvantage when evaluating cards. And this is still true for the rest of the video in order to simplify calculations. However, class advantage or disadvantage is quite an important consideration when determining the value of the card. That's because the 15% bonus or penalty to damage ends up becoming a significant amount of stats. The only reason this point is mentioned after all the other points is because class advantage is slightly more inconsistent and dependent on the meta. This means this factor is slightly less important than the previous points. Let's use back the previous example of Cerestis and Sandal to drive the point across. As we have discussed previously, Cerestis is a better card than Sandal because it can deliver more stats than Sandal. However, in the current meta, plants and reptiles are simply everywhere, and bug cards deal an extra 15% damage against plants and reptiles. That means Sandal can deal an extra 15% damage while Cerestis doesn't have any advantage. This of course makes Sandal potentially better than Cerestis. Of course, having said that, this highly depends on the meta. In a meta where birds and aquas are dominant, Cerestis will be better. In a meta where plants and reptiles are dominant, Sandals will be better. But the point remains, class advantage matters. More damage is generally better than more shields. Let's take a look at these two cards, Orenda and Babylonia. Assuming we do not take into consideration the card abilities, these two cards have an equal amount of card stats. Both have a total of 150, but instinctively we know that Orenda is a better card than Babylonia. Why? The answer to that is simply, damage is slightly more valuable than shields. And there are three reasons for this. The first reason is because a defensive Axie can only play 4 cards, but your opponent can always play more than 4 offensive cards. Assuming both players have unlimited energy and unlimited cards, the defending Axie is always going to lose. This game by design favors attackers over defenders because of the way battle is designed. The second reason is because damage is always useful, while shields can be wasted. What do I mean by this? Whenever you play a card with high damage, you can always be sure that that high damage will be translated into your opponent's Axie losing health. Even if you somehow hit your opponent's brick wall, you are both somewhat equal because both of you spent energy and cards to maintain the status quo. However, having a high defense might not necessarily mean that you are doing better. If your opponent outplays you by not attacking into your highly shielded Axie, your shields are essentially wasted and you lose cards and energy. The third reason is because of the same type bonuses and class advantage bonuses. Meaning, if you use Pumpkin on a plant Axie, you can get a 10% bonus on shields. However, the damage component can gain a 10% same type bonus, on top of that, a 15% class advantage bonus. Meaning, it is possible to get a maximum of 25% more damage but only a maximum of 10% more shields. Now, having said that, you can also get a class disadvantage to your damage component, while your shields will always be a flat 10% same type bonus. This point somewhat negates the benefit argument of class advantage. But the point I wanted to drive across is that damage is still slightly better than shields, all else being equal. Having said that, do not go all out just to get the highest damage cards around. Shields are also important as they allow you to brick wall, which is sometimes important to outplay your opponents. Ultimately, whether damage or shield is more important will depend on the amount of raw card stats that the Axie has. But in general, more damage is always going to be slightly better, all else being equal. As a final note, this is also the reason why healing Axies are not the dominant archetype. Although heal cards give absolutely massive stats in general, they are limited by the combat system, which favors damage over shields. In summary, find cards that give 150 stats or more, if possible. Having more stats simply mean you can do more for the same amount of cards. Cards can cheat the 150 stat rule through card abilities. Just because a card has higher stats doesn't mean it is automatically better. Axie stats, class advantage, and competing cards in that Axie's card slot are also important to consider. More damage is usually better than more shields.